All right, we should be live on everything, but some. All right, and now we are on Instagram as well.
All right, let me know when you're ready to start.
We are good.
All right. Thank you. Hello. Thank you for being with us. This is a panel hosted by Foundations for Divergent Minds in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness and Action Month. As you may know, autistic people experience high rates of domestic violence. There have been multiple studies documenting this, and last year, Foundations for Divergent Minds surveyed and interviewed autistic survivors about their experiences. While addressing the abuse of autistic people is multifaceted and requires acknowledgement of the ways in which multiple forms of systemic oppression can impact survivors, we hope this panel will allow all of us to imagine better ways of supporting autistic people who experience abuse. So before we begin, we'll just go around and introduce ourselves, and then if we can all give a visual description of ourselves, that'd be helpful for people who are joining us. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Morgan Hunter. I use they, their, and they, them pronouns. I'm an autistic social worker, and most of my work is around research and education focused around disability and sexual health and violence prevention. Identify as a survivor myself, and so this work is very personal and very meaningful to me. And I'm really excited that we're here to have this conversation today. And then for a visual description, I am a white person in my mid 30s with short brown hair. I'm wearing glasses with thick black frames, and I have a hot pink shirt on and a couple of piercings in one ear. And let's see. Osmond, would you like to go next?
Yes, hi, I am Oswald Latimer. I am the founding president of Foundations for Divergent Minds. I am actually just going to be around today to manage the screen. We have been doing this domestic violence work for a couple of years now in order to meet the needs of our community better. As Morgan said, we have a very high rate of uh, uh, being the victims of domestic violence, and so we have been focusing on this following my own uh, survival from a relationship or a marriage. Um, I am going to be off screen now, and I will pass it on to somebody else.
All right. I'll just popcorn to who's next on my screen. Jessica, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Jessica Mathis, she, they pronouns. I identify as a survivor, though not a survivor of IPV. I am autistic, though I was diagnosed at a time when Asperger's was still a common diagnosis, so I tend to identify more commonly with Aspies as a description. I have a background in social work, working in a nonprofit that provided culturally specific services for African American, Latino, and LGBTQ survivors of domestic violence. I also worked in housing policy, and now I work for the county running the youth and DSV services programs for the Joint Office of Homelessness. So that's kind of how I came to the table. As for a visual description, I am a dark-skinned Afro-Latino woman, femme presenting with long curly hair that is up in a bun and a tendril on the left side of my face, and I am wearing some amount of makeup. And I'm wearing like a gray tank top and a beige cardigan. And I will pass it to who is next on my screen. And I see a Jack Sanders.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jack Sanders. My pronouns are they, them. I am autistic. I'm also a survivor. I'm in my late 30s. I am non-binary. I'm wearing a green hoodie and a green baseball cap and headphones and a rainbow glasses chain. And I'm glad to be here with you all. Thank you. I guess I'll pass it on to Timotheus.
Yes, yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone, or afternoon. My name is Timotheus Gordon, also known as TJ Gordon, he, his, him pronouns. I am a autistic researcher slash advocate and also a writer and blogger. I identify as a survivor and a supporter of survivors also, since I know either many of my friends who are survivors or unfortunately those who passed away or died because of um, domestic or sexual violence. So that's why I'm here. To describe myself, I'm I'm behind a virtual background of a living room set with a piano, couch, and fireplace. And to describe my physical being, I describe myself as a African American king size um, genderqueer cis male sitting in a chair, and I have short locks, glasses, a black cardigan, jeans, and a black t-shirt. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'll pass off to Kate.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Uh, I am an autistic person, a social worker, and I have experienced interpersonal violence in the past, so I'm a survivor. I'm here, of course, because of my concerns, but also I have a background in work with domestic violence. I long ago managed a women's shelter for people who are experiencing domestic violence. And I'm in private practice as a social worker, and this still occasionally comes up in my practice. And often I realize people are describing incidents of interpersonal violence without realizing the severity or the seriousness of their situation. So um, I appreciate a chance to always to talk about this. It seems to be everywhere. And I am an older white cis woman. I'm a non-binary person. My pronouns are she, they. I'm in my office with a bookcase behind me. I have long hair. I think I said that, and I'm wearing a kind of fall colored top with florals and a pink sweater.
Great. Thank you, everyone. All right. Next, we're going to go over some group agreements for audience members. This is just to help make this a safer space for all of us. All right. So, and also to give you an idea of what to expect from our time together today. So, we will respond to your questions toward the end of the panel. So if we don't get to them immediately, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring you. It just means that we're going to focus on the questions that we have first, and then we'll try to get to your questions toward the end. And then as we've acknowledged, we'll be talking about potentially activating topics today. That's not our goal is not to cause trauma reactivation, but please check in with yourself and take breaks as needed if the content becomes heavy or reactivating for you. Your own well-being is important. Do not blame autistic survivors for the abuse that they experience. I shouldn't have to say this, but sometimes this does come up unintentionally. And this might include things like insinuating that the abuse is the fault of a person for not understanding social situations. The abuse is never the fault of the person who experiences it. So we just want to clarify that. Respect people's pronouns. And then if you have a disagreement with someone in the comments section, please ask questions for clarifications rather than making assumptions. All right. My first question, and this will be for all four of the panelists, and you can answer in whatever order you want. We can just raise your hand if you want to go first or next. I'm going to start off with this question, which is why is it important that we center the experiences of autistic survivors? Anyone want to have any thoughts on that?
I'll volunteer as tribute.
Yeah, go ahead, Timotheus.
Oh no, my apologies. Unfortunately, I do work by at the university. I do work by a hospital, so it may be some sirens going off. So I will be mindful to mute myself when it happens. But to me, it is important that we center the experiences of autistic survivors. I mean, to me, it's a simple one because it is our story. It impact us the most, and the way that people could help us as survivors is to learn from us directly. Yes, it's okay to go to the family members and such, but what will be more impactful than to connect with our community, in particular those who are impacted by interpersonal violence the most? Us.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's probably the most important thing that we can do is to learn directly from the people who are experiencing violence. Does anyone else have any thoughts on why it's important to center the experience of autistic survivors?
I would probably jump in by saying I feel like our particular community has gone from being, I think, invisible to most people. I think that autism used to carry a very specific image in the media or the popular mind, to the point where I think most of us who were considered high functioning were like very masking, and I think the goal was not to be perceived as autistic, right? And so then I think there was this huge movement for neurodiversity, which is great. And I think that our I like to think of them. I like to think of them as our chatty partners in neurodiversity. The folks who are more our friends who have ADHD, I think really lead that. But I also think that their experience of neurodiversity is really different. And that's great. We're all different, but I do think they tend to be, I think, due to the nature of how they show up, they tend to be the forefront. And so I think we went from being invisible to now being really visible, but also still kind of like lumped in with a group that experiences the world very differently. And I also think that the way that our neurodiversity presents itself leads to a lot of misconceptions about like something as basic as how we feel things and how things impact us. And so much of that, I think, is a part of interpersonal relationships, and then ultimately IPV, which is I realized I said that word and didn't said that those letters and didn't explain what that word. That's what we call intimate partner violence, which is DV with inside of a romantic relationship. And there's the broader umbrella of DV, which could be, parent, child, elder, other forms of abuse. But I think that intimate partner violence, I think, is very misunderstood or very not understood how that dynamic happens when one person experiences interpersonal relationships differently. So I think that is, I think it's always important to understand the perspective of every community, but I think that's a particular area of concern, and it's surprising just how completely unaddressed it is within the world of intimate partner violence.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would really agree with that from what I've seen and experienced as well. Jack or Kate, do you have any feelings or thoughts about that you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to tag on to what Jessica was saying about how I think that a reason to highlight this population with the problem of domestic violence is that autistic people are more easily isolated by abusive partners. Autistic people are less likely to have an adequate social support network. They're more likely to be unemployed or to live in poverty. And so there's already a kind of set of pre-existing conditions, we could say, that make it easy for autistic people to end up in situations where there's no eyes on them. Nobody knows what's happening, and their partner can um, shield them from anyone who does know them more successfully because they're just so much more likely to have a scant set of connections in their lives anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the isolation is such a big piece to that.
Yeah, I wanted to. I had something similar to say. I was just thinking about like how my experience as an autistic person has been very me centered by default. Like growing up in the culture that I was in, my experiences were I was encouraged to like operate outside of my own experience. And so I think if we don't center autistic survivors, the default is sort of a really me-centered existence where like the message is it doesn't matter how you feel, it matters only how others perceive you, or it doesn't matter what your experience is, it just matters what other people experiences of you. And so I feel like that's often the default, and so it's important to like proactively push back against that.
Kind of to what Kate was saying, I feel like it's almost easier to gaslight us in some ways because I know there are so many ways in which I consider myself an intelligent person, but I spent a significant amount of my life relying externally on other people. Fortunately, I've surrounded myself with like really good friends, but again, that not many, but always at least one to like check like my perception of things because I know it's often off. And so, I am much quicker, I think, to like second guess myself. And I think in an abusive relationship, that's such a tool to be able, when you have one partner who's just by default willing to like defer. I think like what Jack was saying, willing to defer externally because I think we're raised to believe that because we struggle with that we're then like our reality is like inherently wrong or lesser for that. And so it's just such a really bad place to be if the other person is has manipulation as their intent.
Thank you, everyone. Any final thoughts on that before we move on? All right. So first of all, I'm going to ask a question to those of you who identify as survivors of domestic violence yourself. What sorts of things have been helpful to you as a survivor? This could be maybe even like things just like maybe something interpersonally, maybe something like a friend or someone said or did, or really anything that you can think back on that might have been helpful to you.
Well, I'll just chime in. For me, it was just seeking out information on how very common this problem is, and putting it in perspective for myself, because I think it's natural that people are likely to feel some shame, or like they have contributed to their victimization, or that they missed something. They let somebody get away with something, or let somebody take advantage of them, and that can be deeply humiliating, aside from the physical experience of being assaulted. So just knowing that this happens to a lot of people, and I didn't know I was autistic in that chapter of my life, but now I realize that being autistic made it more likely that I would have this kind of experience of somebody harming me. And that once I learned how many people had this experience, and that I was not isolated in this, that was a big help to me to just put things in perspective, and recognize how many people this happens to, and that this is unfortunately a very human experience in all kinds of social groups, and kind of categories of people. This is something that happens extremely frequently.
Yeah, that was, I think, similar to my experience as well, I would say.
Yes, this is Timothy speaking. Uh, I think you touched on it already, Jessica, on the importance of having a support system, even if your support system could look more like an all-out support system, or people who are neurodivergent at least and experience similar things. I think, to me, having a support system of people who believe your story and won't judge you, and supporting your healing journey, has helped me a lot. I also grateful for the online world, because I get to read or learn um, about survivors, especially male survivors of color as well, where not only I learn the statistics and their stories, but also ways that I could better identify the situation that I'm in, better identify what is a healthy relationship, what is abusive and manipulative, and also ways I could take care of myself during those moments and even afterwards. For I am still healing from what I experienced recently as 5 years ago.
Thank you so much.
This is Jack speaking. Um, I'm thinking about how, like, it's been helpful for me to learn, um, like, knowledge about, like, healthy relationships, but at the same time, I gathered a lot of knowledge long before I experienced healthier relationships, and I feel like experiencing, um, healthier dynamics was, like, made a very big deal. Um, it made a big change for me. Like, for example, when someone would hurt me, having someone else be angry about that. Like a lot of my younger life, I experienced a lot of harm, and the people around me didn't react. It was just a non-reaction, and so that, like, no matter what anyone said about, like, oh, you deserve good things, like, the words didn't match up with the actions. Um, and I really learned on, like, an experience level that what happens to me doesn't matter, or that people can mistreat me, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
It doesn't, no one cares, it doesn't upset anyone, no one's gonna do anything about it. So something that's been very helpful to me is just having relationships with people where they are, like, reacting more appropriately to what's happening to me, and kind of modeling for me, oh yeah, when someone treats you badly, I get really angry. um that's, like, a really helpful for me to learn what that feels like, and what it feels like to receive, like, protective care from people, and, like, in a relationship, in an active friendship or relationship, rather than just reading about it or learning about what it might be like, but, like, experiencing it in my body and experiencing it day to day has been made a big difference.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any final thoughts or reactions before we move on? Okay. Let's see. Jessica, I have a question for you. And Kate, you might also have some thoughts on this since you've also worked in some systems. And then Timotheus and Jack, if you want to jump in as well, please go ahead. But how would you describe the way that systems interact with autistic survivors?
Yeah, this one is both simple and hard. The simple the simple answer is that they don't. And by that I mean they, of course, interact with autistic survivors because autistic survivors exist in the world and therefore come through the doors of providers. But there, I don't know of a single domestic violence program that has been uh, designed for, frankly, folks with any disability in mind. Just to like, just to, just to really put a baseline of how much the bar is like on the floor. Most domestic violence shelters in our region, assuming this is going out to the Pacific Northwest, I'm just realized I'm not sure if it is. They have like one accessible room on the first floor, if that. So, and that's like ADA accessibility. So and I think a lot of us think of ADA accessibility as kind of like the first type of accessibility that we think of. And so if people don't have ADA accessibility, it's kind of like out the window that they think about other things. So, and I'm not sure necessarily if you need a whole program design. I think that there are reasons that agencies have program design around race, around gender, around LGBTQ status. There are reasons for that, but I think the closest you get from just even the initial contact with the screening is a lot of times on the screening forms it will say, do you identify as a person with a disability? Or it might ask you about your source of income, which could indicate a disability income. Of course, plenty of people who are neurodivergent or autistic, especially if you don't have a developmental delay, won't be receiving any type of Social Security income, may not want to or feel comfortable identifying as a person with the disability. And so, I think even just identifying that this is the person you're in front of, but I also think there is an aspect of like, okay, so we know that people who are going to come into our doors are not going to disclose every single barrier they're going to have. And typically, organizations work, and I've been a part of these conversations, they work to make sure the tool is accessible to things people won't disclose, whether it is education, ability to read, that sort of thing. And neurodivergency of any kind doesn't typically come up in this conversation. And so, you know, I think there's so many ways that, I think first the system has to identify. Unfortunately, I think that first the system has to identify why we need to know why we're working with a survivor who has autism, because I think right now there may not be that why that's uplifted. And I think folks know if someone speaks Spanish, they know why having bilingual advocates is important, right? They know that having to have a child translate is inappropriate, or having to have a personal conversation with a translator on the phone isn't optimal, or having that culturally, responsive advocate's important. So I think that's sort of the first step is, even knowing, there's no way for, and I say this as someone who, has seen sort of the data collection side. There's no way for us to even know how many folks with any type of neurodivergency, let alone autism, are accessing our system. And I think a lot of times, fortunately and unfortunately, numbers can be good and bad. A lot of times there isn't even money for starting, what's the word? There's not even money for like implementing things until you have that data. And so I think, just the stigma behind a lot of things already sets you back. And so I feel like I've probably veered pretty far away from the question, but that's where this is where I've ended up. But I'm happy to get back to the question if someone wants to remind me or allow Kate to jump in.
No, that was great, Jessica. Thank you. I think this is complicated. Yeah, Kate or anyone else, do you have any thoughts on how systems interact with autistic survivors?
Well, this is Kate speaking. I don't feel so current with this because I'm not really working in a system anymore as a self-employed person, but I can tell you I'm old enough to remember a time before we even had any domestic violence shelters. We know that women couldn't even get their own credit cards until 1974, which is 2 years after I graduated high school. And that the domestic violence shelter network only exists because of women's consciousness raising groups and grassroots efforts that started this, because people could see this was a life threatening set of situations. And so they just pulled it together and decided they would start something on their own. There weren't any nonprofits to help them. And I'm not even sure how far we've advanced beyond that time, right? I mean, I think most of these agencies are kind of limping along, are under resourced and underfunded themselves. And so it's not surprising that they don't have the budgets to uh, offer specialized services for specialized populations. That's the unfortunate reality that we live in, that most of these agencies continue to operate on some duct tape and baling twine to hold things together, really is what it amounts to.
Mm-hmm. If I had to, I think something that Kate said resonated with me, or at least it sparked something off. What I will say is what we know about domestic violence is that it can happen to anybody. That's true. But I also like to be really careful with that statement, because the reality is that sort of income and how marginalized increases the duration
Mhm.
and the intensity of the domestic violence. So, what that means is the people coming through the doors of our agencies are more likely to already have other marginalized identities. And so I think that's also a barrier. So, like, for instance, if I'm coming through, like, just like, if I myself personally, I'm coming through the door as a Black woman who's queer, I then also need to add autistic onto it.
Mhm.
So I think for a lot of people, that would just be like another thing. And, uh, same thing goes for our male identified survivors, our queer survivors. So like it's just like one more thing you're adding. And I think for a lot of people that's something you can choose not to disclose. You have your race, for most of us, is on our face. Not everybody, but for most of us it's on our face. If you're being abused by your partner, the gender of your partner probably going to come out at some point, right? So there are a lot of things you don't have control over. And so if you have something that you can choose not to disclose because of, fear of how people are going to treat you, I think that's one more thing that uh, you may not choose to disclose for that reason.
If I may add, also, since we are diving into the intersectionality of it all, um, first off, I feel that because we are viewed sometimes as little children, either, and also the fact that historically autism is seen as something that only children experience and not adults, even though, of course, we grow, we age, meaning there are autistic adults, there are autistic elders. That's how it is. But because of that viewpoint of autism, either they won't believe us or they may perceive us as not capable enough to understand what's going on or express what's going on. Now, whether or not we capable enough to express what's going on, well, it's ableist within itself and define competency. That's another story. But the fact that because we are viewed as childlike, people in the system assume that A, we cannot experience pain, B, we don't know what we talking about, even though some of us could articulate what's going on through voice or typing or whatever. But adding a layer to intersectionality, I will speak for myself, for instance. When I share what's going on to systems or people in general, um, male presenting folks are usually viewed as the perps, even though it can happen to male presenting folks also from any type of relationship. Or also, we are told as men presenting folks, especially cis males, especially if you're in a community of color, men are supposed to enjoy this. Men are supposed to shut up about it. We don't talk about um, interaction that goes bad when it comes to whether it's sexual, emotional, whatever the case may be, with people we close to. And there's a mental health aspect also of where to go to tell or to let out what's going on when there's not that many mental health resources in some of our neighborhoods to begin with. And even from a gender and racial perspective, there's a lot of stigma against mental health, let alone violence and the after effects through mental health. So I do agree that part of what's happening when it comes to the system helping autistic survivors is a deep, deep, deep intersectional web.
Thank you. Jack, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I I haven't had as much direct interactions with the system. I think partly because I stayed away from certain systems. I mean, I had the privilege to stay away, but I also stayed away because of I could tell that it might be a place of danger and not help for me. And I am thinking about like something I wanted to share is that I was in a I was looking for help at one point, and I told a social worker that I'm autistic, and her response was, "Oh, who told you that?" And it was like very, condescending and kind of it just it made me shut down, and I didn't really know how to respond to that, but um just being treated as like an unreliable narrator or like an object of pity. Like, yeah, it just I definitely made attempts to try to get help sometimes, or like I sought out trying to help, and some of the help was also very gender based. Like, oh, here we have this group available, but it's like for women or for men, and if I didn't, I didn't always know how to what group to be a part of as a non-binary person, or if I would be like welcome or safe in those groups. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of like the system not recognizing um autistic people, and not necessarily having the ability to recognize us, or yeah, it's almost like the fear of if you are recognized, that might actually make it worse for you. So yeah, I mostly just want to echo what everyone else has already said about that.
Thank you, everyone. Right. Move on to another question. Let's see here. Right. If you could change one thing about how systems interact with autistic survivors, or if you could change one thing about what sorts of supports are available to autistic survivors, what is that one change that you would make? And this is to everyone who would like to go first.
I could go first, and that's fine. So, part of my work as a writer and even a researcher advocate at the university that I'm in is I help create plain language materials and also social media posts on advocacy topics that affects disabled people of color in the Chicagoland area, but also beyond Chicagoland also. Um, One thing I would like to see more of, and I'm glad there are places that are doing it now, is to create easy to read, plain language, or visual information on what is it's a what does interpersonal violence look like, how to get help, how to support someone who is in that situation, ways to cope or resources to go to cope and advocate for yourself and others in that situation. Because oftentimes, some of the information may be too scientific or too wordy for us, or some of us may prefer less words or visual aids.
Thank you for all the work you do, and yeah, that sounds like it'd be a really helpful contribution. Anyone else have any thoughts on one change that you would make to either how systems interact with autistic survivors or the supports that are available to autistic survivors?
I think without dismantling the entire system, or I also don't want this to come off as being like anti woman. I have so much. Obviously, I'm a woman, and I have so much respect and appreciation for all the grassroots work that female identified people have done. But I think what's true for a lot of autistic women uh, is an experience I think a lot of us share is sometimes that the struggle or the bridge in communication is even deeper. The way that women and girls are socialized to communicate and the levels of nonverbal communication that happen. And so, um, as someone who studied this work and someone whose job it was to navigate this work and my colleagues, um, it was really difficult for me in that position of being there as the person working. And so I can only imagine how it would be to be on the receiving end as a survivor who's experiencing trauma and isn't, I don't know, no one should have to like mask or be at their like most uh alert, I guess for lack of a better word, self. But I do think in the DV, I can't speak for all social services, but I think within the DV world, it is very, 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 very relational, very interpersonal, very, you know, it's all about building relationships, and it's very much like that. And I think it makes it different than other social services. And I think it can make it different in a really, it can be a really powerful um, tool, and I think it can be better in a lot of ways. But I think the downside to this, and I think something that is like almost never checked because it's not seen as a problem, is interpreting other people through your lens of how a traumatized survivor should behave, right? And I mean, I think we see a lot of that even for non-neurodivergent people. A lot of that has changed in our understanding of the different ways that traumatized people cope and show up. But I even think just the idea that you're not presenting enough, and it wouldn't necessarily stop you from getting resources, but again, I think when you're talking about scarcity and when you're talking about an advocate who, due to that scarcity, may go the extra mile for somebody that they have more empathy for, someone that they're connecting more with. And some of that's just a problem with the system, right? I mean, I think advocates shouldn't be working unpaid overtime based on the system knowing that their heartstrings are being pulled. But also, if they are going to go this extra mile, as unfair as it is, it should at least be equitably spread. And so I think that, um, you know, I can never be certain, again, just because of the way people do or don't identify. But I definitely feel like I've seen certain people get, maybe better treatment because they present in a really sympathetic way. And that's not just limited to neurodivergency. I've seen it happen in like parenting situations where one person's parenting style is doesn't harbor as much sympathy, and so they're criticized more. And so you can just imagine in that kind of environment how being autistic can be a disservice. And I think especially sometimes in the way that autistic people to other people are perceived as non-reactive or unemotional or this, and it's bad enough when it happens in like it's bad enough when it happens with the police and these other systems, but in the nonprofit sphere where that's supposed to be survivor centered, where you're not supposed to have to prove that these things have happened to you, to then have somebody like judge you or think that maybe it wasn't so bad, or maybe we don't need to give this housing resource to this person. um, I think I would just ask my colleagues to 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 check that, and um, really not. And like I said, we're talking about an industry where it's almost all women. um, and on the direct service level, I think it's safe to say it's either all women or all women slash transgender, not gender nonconforming people. um, so I think it's a big problem. And like I said, I know I've had my struggles in it as someone working.
Yes, may I really want to add to it, Jessica, and then I promise I will give the floor to you, Jack, or Kate afterwards. But this is really, really burning because I think you mentioned a one unspeakable that's not mentioned when it comes to supporting autistic survivors, especially from a gender perspective. I also want to add two quick ones as well that we often don't mention. One is I just lost it. Oh yes, one of them is it is giving the space to giving us survivors the space to be okay with naming the perpetrators or naming the system that's causing all this, not just for the sake of calling out, but also to address um, that the system and the people doing it need help also. They probably, the system is broken, so the system, like you mentioned, Jessica, has to be fixed. Even from a personal level, some of the people, the close people who are the perpetrators, may be going through or been through interpersonal violence themselves, and they never been addressed for that either. So, with that being said, it's okay to name systems or to name the person if you want to hold people and systems accountable, but potentially help people and systems also. The second thing I want to mention is that, let's be honest, how often we in the autistic community are taught self-defense? How often we are told that you can fend off people or ways to advocate for ourselves when we are in that situation? Not often. We are often told immediately just take it, go tell an adult, go tell somebody you trust, like the police. But as a Black person who is also autistic, do I really trust the police? Do I really trust people in my community that much? Not really. And I understand, historically or even still, we are seen as quote unquote weak, whether now that's another issue to even address. So I don't want to get into the masculinity or whatever of it all. But we still have the right to learn, how to say no, how to find ways to get out of the situation, whether it's by ourselves or through people around us who we could trust at the time. Or it's okay that we might have to use um, non lethal techniques or carry non lethal weapons to not harm, but to get out of the situation only.
Thank you, Timotheus. Kate or Jack, do you have any thoughts? The question was if you could make one change to either how systems interact with autistic survivors or the supports that are available to autistic survivors. What change would you make?
Do you have anything, Jack?
Sure, yeah. Um, I, I'm, I'm thinking about how many times I have, in the past, I have felt like my choices between a certain kind of abuse or isolation, and even when I know that the way I'm being treated is not okay, it's very hard to say no to certain relationships or types of treatment if the alternative is isolation. You know, I'm saying no to a friend without a lot of other friendships to turn to, especially when intimacy is involved. Um, and I mean, the thing that has been most powerful for me is connecting with other autistic people, and um, that has really helped me gain a lot of social confidence. It's not a guarantee that I will automatically connect or click with every autistic person I meet, but there's a much higher chance that we will understand each other and have some shared um, ways of experiencing the world, that we will have a more um, productive like kind of way of relating to each other. And um, I guess I would really love to see more autistic led support for making social connection. Um, I think sometimes some of what I have run into when I've been looking for those things are things that feel very much like they have internalized the holistic gaze. And what I mean by that is like autistic people who are kind of copying holistic people in like, oh, let's have a group where one person is the expert and tells everyone else what to do. Um, and I think that there's just like so many other possibilities for autistic people helping one another to create social connection. Like for example, I find groups kind of challenging, but maybe if someone was almost like a friend matchmaker and could help me connect and make a friend, or if I go out and look for friends and then I can talk to someone every week about, hey, I found this friend, I don't know how I feel about them and I'm feeling kind of uneasy around them, like even just having someone to process with as I make relationships. And yeah, I have a lot of vision for like possibilities there. And I know these things are like hard to get, you know, funding for, but I want to see autistic led um, social connection making that is fresh. Yeah.
That would be so helpful and welcome. Yeah. Kate, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to let this percolate for another minute. But yeah, my thoughts are remembering when I worked in a shelter, they are almost entirely women, organizations run by and composed of women. Many places use a lot of volunteers, and I think there is a kind of wish to give an empathic response to people who are clients in this kind of service that could be overwhelming for autistic participants to experience. There are so many good-hearted people who want to offer empathy and offer counseling in a shelter setting, and to have some kind of experience of emotional intimacy, either in a group format or one-on-one. And I think a lot of times autistic people just need quiet and their own room, and they need to be left alone. And that is a therapeutic intervention. But it's hard for women, especially, to appreciate that because they're so used to kind of glomming onto one another in order to offer support. So I think that might be something for these groups, these teams to be sensitized to or aware of, that sometimes giving support means allowing space and letting people reflect or journal or seek you out when they need you, rather than expecting this kind of inclusive approach that it might be too much.
That's very relatable.
Mhm.
You know, right. We have about 30 minutes left. I'm going to check and see if we have any last questions that I want to ask you before we go over to the audience questions. Yes. Do have one. What advice would all of you give to the friends, family, and professionals who are working with or who want to help autistic survivors?
I could go first on this one. I'm gonna come at this maybe from a personal, personal, professional. It's all mixed, but I would say listen. I feel like when you're, I feel like I feel like people are so used to gleaning information from undertone and from so many cues. And I've almost been in situations where people want to like argue with me about like what I meant or how I felt in a moment. And I have to be like, no, I said what I meant. I meant what I said. I don't even have the capacity to be running when people explain to me like the way their brains work and all of the different like tiers of like things they could be meaning and thinking at the same time. I'm like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so I just really wish people, like the best friends I've ever had are people who listen to me and believe the words I've chosen to say to them and believe the actions that I put out. And if they ever feel like there's an inconsistency or they're not understanding something, they just say it to me, right? And they ask me how we can better communicate. And so while there's so many other things I think that go into supporting somebody going through domestic violence in particular, I think folks need to remember that folks going through any kind of trauma, whether you have autism or not, that person's at their probably their worst ability to communicate and to to get their to interact. They're at their worst. They're just because we're autistic doesn't mean we don't have fight, flight, or freeze, doesn't mean we don't have any of those other things going on. And so like the best you can do to be on our level when most of us are working so hard to be on your level, like every day, day in, day out, if someone with autism is like coming to you saying, I'm experiencing this bad thing, or I think I'm going through this thing, just like do your best to like listen to the words and not pay attention to how they're being, I think, delivered. I mean, I'm not saying don't look for warning signs if this person is presenting really differently than they normally do, but I would just say, especially if you're a stranger, like please listen to the words that they are choosing to say, and respect the words they're choosing to say, and kind of like other people have said, don't infantilize them, don't patronize them, don't do any of that other stuff. No one likes that. And if somebody does need additional support, maybe like in their day-to-day life, I'm sure they'll bring that person up if they're safe. That could also be the person that they're trying to get away from, in which case, trying to drag that person in the room at the first sign of a problem is not helpful either. Um, so, yeah, listen to people in their totality, and then go from there. That would be my advice. I think we lost our host. Did we lose our host?
Uh-oh.
I will take over while, because I'm not sure where Morgan went. Were there any other? I forgot what the question was. If somebody can remind us.
Oh, sure. I think it was being asked, what advice would you give to friends, families, and professionals who want to help autistic survivors?
Did anybody else have thoughts on that?
Well, what occurs to me is helping people establish or reestablish a routine. A lot of autistic people really benefit from knowing what to expect, uh, inhabiting a predictable environment, having something that they can look forward to doing that might be a familiar activity, or maybe watching the same movies or TV shows we've watched again and again. Allowing us to carve out a routine for ourselves that's going to give us the support and structure we need. And that might include other people, but it might just be our own thing. And we know how to take care of ourselves if we're unbothered and allowed to create the kind of plan that we need ourselves that has worked in the past.
Thank you. And I somehow lost the connection for a moment there, so I'm not sure. Timotheus and Jack, were you able to answer? Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I want to, but if that's fine, I want to be the last person. Out of respect, I'll get up my privilege.
Sure, I'm glad to go next. I guess my answer was going to be similar to what you said, Jessica. Like I was thinking about not making assumptions. Um, I think that a lot of people, we relate to each other by projecting our own experience on each other, which is totally human. But I just had a lot of people make a lot of assumptions about like what I have or have not experienced. Yeah, like I, I guess it helps when people can listen to me and my stories. Yeah, in like a curious way, and rather than like I feel like for me as an autistic person, like I've experienced a lot of like extreme social trauma, and people might meet me and be like, "Oh, like you must have had a pretty cool time, like I did," and yeah, it's just like or like people also assume I think because I learned to mask as a way of like surviving and coping, I've had a lot of people assume that I'm not in as much distress as I am because I seem so quote unquote functional. People assume like, oh, you're not, running around screaming right now, so you must not be in a lot of pain or something like that. So yeah, I guess just trying to like pull back on assumptions, and it really helps when people can listen to me and believe me when I'm talking about like the fact that I'm struggling or have struggled a lot in the past. talking about things like isolation or having really extremely negative social experiences. Yeah, it means a lot for people to make space, even if my stories are kind of challenging for them or like contradict what they think they know about the world or what they think they know when they see me or hear me.
I guess before we get to the grand ending, I just wanted to piggyback on what Kate said. Um, I and kind of I think what you're saying, Jack, I'm someone I think people don't look at me and think of like stemming and like bodily irritation, but that's like a hardcore thing for me. And um, it's hard enough to go through a traumatic experience. It's another level to have so much change happen. And like when I have a lot of change happen, I have to have I can't sit on those things anymore. I have to be allowed to like process that agitation out of my body and be calm before I can do anything else. And it's like it's I think it for a lot of people it can be disturbing to witness uh, and I need that. I very much need that space, and I can't operate with that level of like agitate internal agitation happening. And so I think adding that like difficulty with change that comes with like exiting and moving in and out of like a traumatic situation, whether it's domestic violence or something else, I think is definitely something to keep in mind.
Yes, this is Timothy speaking. Um, I definitely want to piggyback what A1 said in response to the question. And to sum it all up in a few words, excuse my language, um, shut the fuck up and listen. Shut the fuck up and listen to us. But to address family, friends, and even for those with multiple partners, the partners that you trust, yes, there are uh, non monogamous or polyamorous folks who are survivors also, you know. It's not just mono folks. But, for those in those areas that I mentioned, understand our love language, understand how we want to be helped or loved at that particular point, and understand that your ways of helping may not be how we want to be helped. So let's use myself as an example to how to explain it. Some people want to talk to me or lecture me right there and there. I don't want to be lectured right then and there. I want a hug, or I don't want to be touched, consensually, of course, and take it however you will. I want to talk about sports. I want to be fed. That's what I need at that moment. Then, if I'm well enough or have the spoons to talk and listen, then I will do so. But I feel like it's very important for those in our intimate circles to help us in a way that we want to be helped, to understand how we receive love and not just help immediately. Because if, let's say, you want to help the autistic person in IPV situations, but you trigger them more, then you're just of a perpetrator to me as the perp during the acts.
Thank you, everyone. Any final thoughts or comments before we move on to audience questions?
Well, I just wanted to tag on one other concept I haven't heard anybody mention is that you can't very well expect a person who's just gone through some kind of domestic violence or is trying to get out of a bad situation to be able to mask. And so, just for people who are supporting us, knowing that we're going to be much less capable in these unfortunate circumstances to kind of pull together a social persona or make conversation. And a good way to support us might be to, as I said earlier, like get together and watch a familiar movie. Or let's take a walk and not talk and be out in nature. Having some simple interactions where just the proximity and physical presence of somebody that we're comfortable with might be sufficient for us, and we're not likely to be as needing to verbally process things as somebody who's not autistic.
Thank you. All right, Aswin, since I got kicked out temporarily because of some connection problems, I'm not able to see the comments since I think I lost them. Do you want to share any of the comments that, let's see, we have a question by Jajin. Pak, why is it important for DV counselors, advocates to know to be better in responding and providing support? So why is it important? Any thoughts on that?
Professionals first.
Go ahead.
Well, I can speak for on behalf of the advocates and the social workers. What is important to know? Well, unfortunately, I would say at this point, I don't think that most DV advocates even understand autism, at least not as I'm sure there's different levels of understanding, right? Because there's different levels of education among DV advocates, all the way from your folks that are going to be licensed clinical social workers, though there's no, even though you can obviously have a specialty even within that, right? All the way to folks with lived experience. And then there isn't a ton of training on working with survivors who are neurodivergent. That's just something that hasn't really come up as much in, I would say, the social work world or even the behavioral health world. I think they're just now doing a lot of behavioral health training on working with folks who have autism. So I think that is, so what I would say is first, just a base level knowledge of what it's like to have autism, what that spectrum can even look like. If you haven't been to a training like that, if you're if a lot of times when you're at these agencies, you're kind of like fed training opportunities. If that's not a training opportunity that's coming to you, but you see an opportunity out in the community, request to take it, right? Request either, if it's free, obviously take it. If it's not, maybe request it with professional development funds. If it's something you think is lacking at your agency, sometimes agencies can bring a trainer on, but I would say that I think it's something that the entire DV systems can benefit from. And then I would say pretty much like how we do everything else in the DV system, learning from folks with lived experience, getting folks who have autism involved in the assessment tools, the intake tools, getting people's feedback on, how you're doing services out in the community, getting feedback on folks' experiences in shelter, folks' experiences getting services, pretty much how you would treat any other population of people to better cater services to folks. I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel, but you do have to put the energy towards it. And since people with autism are not a monolith. I can't like give you one specific thing to know better. There's a lot of things to know better. But I think the upside is that, we have done this before with other populations, but we have to put the energy towards doing it. And I think it starts with education.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on what is important for DV counselors, advocates to know to be better in responding and providing support? Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I don't know if I can answer that question directly. This is Kate speaking again, but I want to affirm that in contrast to other larger institutions, like in contrast to corporate settings or healthcare settings or educational settings, I think the people who have inhabited and uh, worked in the domestic violence arena are very much in the forefront of being revolutionary, really, in insisting on human rights and dignity and self-determination. And so I just want to make sure that it's validated that I'm sure that that trend will continue. And the more we get to know about neurodivergence and autism specifically, the more we're going to see like this is a place where it's welcomed. People want to understand. There's a drive to be inclusive and to make sure that there's a kind of sense that you belong here. And so I think that it's really wonderful that we're having this talk because these are the people who are curious about this stuff, and that's part of what's uh, so powerful about people who work in these kinds of settings is that they really are motivated. They really want to know and they want to help. And that's very sincere. So I just want to say that for whoever's listening.
Thank you. Any other final thoughts on this before we move on to another audience question?
I'm thinking about how, like, for some autistic people, there can be like, uh, I can be really good, like quote unquote, good at one thing and struggling with another, and just thinking about like, you know, um, wanting people to know that like they might have an autistic client who is like really able to explain something, but then really struggling to explain what's happening to them at home, or like has a really kind of fancy job, but then really struggling to feed themselves, or just I guess I feel like sometimes there's just like a lack of recognition of like struggle, or it's because people are looking for like you must be struggling in all the areas or doing well in all the areas. And so I guess I'm just thinking about like how to recognize that. Um, yeah, just how to recognize that. And the other thing that I was thinking about was, um, I guess in my experience, I feel like there's a larger cultural resistance sometimes to acknowledging that disabled people are harmed by caregivers and partners. Like, we don't want to talk about disabled people being abused, and because it's like sort of unthinkable, or it's like, there's this idea that the people who care for disabled people are saints because they're caring for them. And so I feel like I've just encountered some of that narrative in my life where it's like I didn't even recognize the way that I was being mistreated because I was taught to see myself as like the people around me are automatically saints for like putting up with me, housing me, relating to me, you know. So I'm just thinking about pushing back against that, like wanting people in these positions to think about that bias that they might bring when they encounter a disabled client or someone that they perceive to be disabled and be like, oh, like they're probably not being abused. Like just
Hmm.
noticing that.
Hmm. This is Timotheus speaking, or TJ speaking, and J Jen. If I want to answer your question directly because if I remember correctly, we do a lot of work together on mental health. The reason that I bring up mental health because I feel as a self advocate, as well as an advocate for mental health, it is a very important for those that feel to provide um, mental health support that's outside of institutionalization or hospitalization. I think is important to have services where we could go to resources at our own pace, or if we in a mental health emergency that coincides with what's happening to us in a IPV situation, we could choose where we can go, or we could go to mental health resources that could not only address the an IPV, but also our mental health as well as our intersecting identities too. Otherwise, I think my fear is within the current mental health system is when we ask for those resources, then people will be quick to send us to a mental health clinic, which on paper is okay, but then speaking as a BIPOC person, that's scare us because that could mean going to jail. That could mean being mistreated by um, people in the mental health wards and hospitals, or experience police violence, aka death. So I feel it is important for um, the counselors and advocates to provide mental health resources that is inclusive and supportive of the disability community and other marginalized communities, and B, there are alternatives to just going to jail or going to the mental health ward, which to some that's jail or worse.
Thank you so much, Timotheus. I had a response I want to make to the question about what's important for DB counselors and advocates to know, and that is, I used to do a lot of work around like running a support group for survivors of abuse in the kink and BDSM communities. And a lot of them ended up being autistic. No surprise. There's research confirming that quite autistic people are drawn to BDSM and kink. I think that Timotheus had mentioned earlier on how survivors might also be polyamorous. It's not just monogamous people who experience violence, but it's really important that the people who want to support autistic survivors realize that autistic survivors might be kinky, they might be polyamorous, they might be queer, and not and among other identities. But I think oftentimes, and particularly because we know that autistic people might be drawn to BDSM or to polyamory because how it might meet their needs around relationships and neurodiversity. But to not stigmatize that or to blame them for that, or to blame their need for that sexual expression, for the abuse that they experience. Because I think that those attitudes are very prevalent, and I think that a lot of our attitudes toward BDSM oftentimes blame survivors for the abuse, or they equate liking BDSM with some sort of a pathology. And so that's really important to be aware of, to know that there are people who are autistic, who are survivors of abuse, who enjoy BDSM, for whom that is like an important part of their sexuality. And abuse might still happen in those contexts, as it happens in all contexts of sexual expression and relationships. And so to educate yourself about those relationships and those dynamics, and to know how to support them without without stigmatizing their need for expression around relationships and sexuality. So, all right, and we are at time. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. So did you have any closing comments to make?
If I was going to make closing comments, I would just say outreach to what we know about communities that have historically not sought out DSV services because of exclusion and because of feelings of being judged is that even if the system changes, the reputation in the community for that, for how they will be treated does not change overnight. And it is the onus is on systems to make sure that they are, for lack of a better word, advertising that change, and they are making sure that they are making it known that their services are welcome, and that means showing up in spaces that people are already in. And, I liked what you said about being a counselor for folks who are in the BDSM community, because I think that's like one of those ways of like, hey, do we know where people are showing up? Do we know where people are struggling? Like, then that's what you do. And also, I hope no DV advocates are necessarily directly referring people into hospitalization. Not to say that's not a right option for folks, but as a DV advocate, I think privacy is a really important part of delivering the service, and there's only so much, privacy that a hospital institution can provide. So, I just wanted to add that part that you do have rights to privacy around your abuse as well, if you're not aware of that. And the Violence Against Women Act, it's called that, but it's for all genders.
This is Timothy speaking, and for those who don't know, October is my birthday month, but also it is DV Awareness Month as well, where this one hit home to me because a very close friend of mine who I had a crush on as a kid succumbed to DV. I'm saying it to say that she is my motivation on why I speak up and against DV and IPV in general in the autistic community and the disability community in general. That needs to stop, and we must have the culturally and disability community supportive resources out there for survivors and also the community around us. She is my motivation for why I'm here to support the work.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. For the people watching in the audience and our panelists, and of course Morgan. Morgan has done so much with this project over the past couple of years, and I really appreciate their efforts here. We are continuing to look for funding so that we can get some things developed, and we will be doing what we can there, because this is such an important topic that we know is missed in literally all the literature, other than the scant bits that we can find in just looking at the prevalence of abuse. So yeah, I appreciate all of your time, and I hope we can continue this conversation at some other point. Thanks.